These are all my books, and I'm going to talk to you about some of my favorites.
Absolutely equally. If he had been told that he would not get a position, the delightful had happened the next day and the next. A secretary. The process of reorganizing a bookshelf like this ends up becoming kind of strangely introspective and self-reflective, because you pick up and touch every single book that you own and you look at it, you revisit it. As you're sorting through certain books, pages and receipts and notes fall out of where they were tucked into the book, and you think about how you're going to categorize them, and you think about why you bought them in the first place and why you've held on to some but gotten rid of others. A personal library is a very personal and kind of revealing thing, and I would like to share with you some of my favorites of the books that I own. Unsurprisingly, my largest category, my tallest tower of books, ended up being the early modern English literature, because that's what I focused on academically. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on drama primarily in early modern English literature, and so most of these books are just plays that I've worked with over the years, and most of them are Shakespeare. You can see a bunch of Signet Classics and Folger's Classics editions in here. But a few of these are a little extra special or a little more interesting than the others, so I'm going to walk you through some of those. Take this one, for example. It's Hamlet, but it's not just Hamlet. This is an edition of Hamlet that compares the 1603 quarto version with the 1623 folio version, between which there are significant changes. Listen to this, for example. Tell me if this sounds like what you remember. To be or not to be? Aye, there's the point. To die, to sleep. Is that all? Aye, all. No, to sleep, to dream. Aye, marry, there it goes, for in that dream of death, when we're awakened and borne before an everlasting judge, from whence no passenger ever returned. That's not the speech. That's not the speech we know, anyway. We know this one, the folio version. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. So this is a really fun one, because you can toggle between the two different versions and see what changes exist between the two of them. Another fun one in my early modern collection is this book, which is the essays of Michel de Montaigne, which were written first in French, I believe in the 1580s, but this edition is specifically the early 17th century English translation of these essays, which we know Shakespeare read. We know because he directly paraphrases one of the essays of cannibals in The Tempest. So by reading this translation of these essays, you're basically in a book club with Shakespeare. Then we have these 3 books, 3 of my favorite early modern English women writers. Aphra Behn, who was a failed spy for the crown, turned very successful playwright in the later 17th century. Margaret Cavendish, who I am in love with her. She's my hero. And then we have Hester Poulter, who wrote in the 50s and 60s, 1650s and 60s, and then her manuscripts were laid away and forgotten about until the 1990s. These manuscripts were never read for centuries until somebody dug them out of an archive in the 90s. That's just the coolest thing to me. And then, of course, we have this thing, The Complete Art in Shakespeare. This was a gift from my parents when I was probably like 15 years old at the most, which means that it's filled with annotations from 15-year-old me, which I have now moved far enough away from in age to no longer find embarrassing, but rather find charming, because that was half my lifetime ago. This is kind of sad, actually. At one point, it looks like I erased my annotations on this page. You can see there were all these like pencil marks that when I was 15 or however old, I must have left about my thoughts about Romeo and Juliet. And then I erased them all when I was not so far enough in age to look back on it fondly, and instead looked back with embarrassment. But now I really wish I could read what I had written here. I can make out, I feel bad for Rosalind. Maybe she was just about to cave. And then Romeo goes chasing after Juliet. I no longer stand by that interpretation that she was just about to cave, but that is fun to know that I used to think that. This one seems to say, yeah, I'm just jealous. I want a Romeo too. Girl, you can do better. Another little treasure contained within this book is this, which is a leaf I picked off a tree outside the Folger Shakespeare Library when I visited as a teenager. This is a very special artifact of the things that mattered to me when I was a teenager, which honestly still kind of overlap with the things that matter to me now. And the final items I would like to showcase from my early modern collection are these 3 editions of Paradise Lost. There are very few texts that I own multiple copies of. Honestly, I think it's just Paradise Lost and Frankenstein. I own 3 copies of each of those. And each 3 of these copies is very meaningful to me for particular reasons. This copy of Paradise Lost, which has notes and introduction by Philip Pullman, author of His Dark Materials, was the first copy of Paradise Lost I ever bought. I bought it at a Borders bookstore to read for my AP English class in high school. And reading this book, I think, really is what set me down the path to pursuing a PhD in English literature. I was absolutely obsessed. And honestly, I still am. This is one of my favorite works of literature of all time. The pages of this are very sticky because I used very low quality Post-it notes to take notes when I was a teenager. And because I read this book so many times across so many years, it's filled with all these annotations, but a lot of them are from me at different points reading it. There's things that I underlined and notes that I wrote when I was 17, and then ones that I wrote when I was probably 20 and possibly even in grad school, although at that point I had a more scholarly edition of the text. This edition of Paradise Lost, which is an academic annotated version, annotated not by a 17-year-old girl, but by Milton scholars, this is the version of the text that I told my students to buy when I taught Paradise Lost in grad school. And I bought it used because your girl loves a bargain, so there are annotations and highlights in it that are not mine, but what this edition has is all of these footnotes. Some pages have more footnotes than actual text on the page, and that's because I knew that my undergrads were going to need a little bit more context and help with some of the things. Did any of them read the footnotes? Did any of them even read Paradise Lost? I have no idea, but this is the edition I chose. And finally, there is this edition of Paradise Lost. I'm not actually sure when this was published, but it has an inscription in it that it was given as a gift for Christmas in 1904. So sometime before 1904. My partner bought this for me when we had been dating for about 3 months, and that was almost 6 years ago. So I love each one of my 3 editions of Paradise Lost, but I especially love them all together as these 3 distinct points in my relationship with this text. The first time I ever read it in high school, when I taught it a decade later in grad school, and this very personal, very non-academic book that is, kind of representative of being known and cared about by somebody. And that's it for my early modern collection of books. Moving up through the centuries, we next have my grand collection of 18th century literature, which is 2 books. 18th century just isn't really my scene, but these 2 books are cool. 2 women-authored texts. We have Eliza Haywood's The Adventures of A of I, and then we have some writing by Mary Wollstonecraft, who is, of course, the mother of my beloved Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. And that brings us into the 19th century. Here are 2 of my editions of Frankenstein. This nice hardcover version, which, yes, this is the version of Frankenstein which was released with some edits made, I believe, in the 1830s. I can tell that it's the edited version because when they introduce the woman who Frankenstein eventually marries, Elizabeth, she is introduced as just an orphan girl, whereas in the original 1818 text, which was the first version of this that was published, Elizabeth is not just some random orphan girl who Frankenstein's family takes in. She's his first cousin. He marries his cousin. So as with Hamlet, you can kind of go between these 2 editions of the text and see what changes have been made to plot or language. The 3rd edition of Frankenstein I own. Brace yourselves, okay? Take a deep breath, collect yourselves. Is a facsimile of the original handwritten manuscript. It's just, okay, this is, within here is facsimile of Mary Shelley's own handwriting. It has doodles, it has smudges, it has math in the margins. Some of the handwriting is her husband's, Percy Shelley's, because he read and made little margin edits and suggestions. Can I tell the difference between their handwritings? No. Can I even read her handwriting most of the time? Also no. But, okay, I'm gonna open it, okay? It is magnificent. Just look at it. It's got this little like cloud tree kind of doodle. She was crossing things out. She was writing one word underneath another word and making little arrows of what should go where. You can see the thought process in this text. I wish I could say that I love all my books equally, but this might be my favorite book that I own. Might be my favorite thing that I own. Might be my favorite object that I have ever held in my hands. And then, for the rest of my 19th century collection, it's nothing remarkable. We've got a little Austen, a little Hardy. We've got the Brontes. I do love the Brontes very much also. This is a fun one, actually. This is the uncensored first edition of The Picture of Dorian Gray. Similarly to Frankenstein, there was an early version initially published, which was then revised in order to make it less controversial. Of course, in the case of Dorian Gray, it was revised to make it a little less gay, but both versions, there's nothing heterosexual about them. But this one, it's even more kind of explicit, the passion that Basil has for Dorian. If you have read Dorian Gray, but you've never read the uncensored version, you should really check it out. And that brings us now into the 20th century. How modern. The 20th century collection is very much a mixed bag. We've got a little Italo Calvino, we've got The Master and Margarita, one of my favorite books I've ever read. We got a little Camus, little Gabriel Garcia Marquez, we got The Hobbit, we got Lady Chatterley's Lover. We've got this book, which I found while cleaning out my bookshelf. I have never seen this book in my life. I don't know where this came from. This book is in Spanish. I do not speak Spanish. My partner is a native Spanish speaker, but this is not his book. This bookshelf organization also revealed to me that I have not just 2 copies of Carson McCullers' The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, but 2 of the exact same copy. One of them I remember buying it, at Shakespeare and Company in Paris. The other one is a mystery. I don't know where it came from. But in addition to these 2 Carson McCullers books, I have these 2, which are each different books, The Normal Way, The Heart is the Lonely Hunter, of course, and The Member of the Wedding. And I don't usually read 20th century American literature, but I have to have space on my bookshelf always for Carson McCullers because she is my namesake. My name, of course, is Carson. And my parents didn't know this at the time, but we have the same birthday, February 19th. And in fact, the same exact day. I was born on the same day as Carson McCullers. I am over 100 years old. My collection of miscellaneous 21st century fiction is relatively small. And most of these, almost all of these actually, I bought within the last year and a half. About 3 years ago, I made a big move, like a suitcases only move. And so I drastically pared down my library in general. A lot of things I donated to a used bookstore where I had been living. Some things I shipped to my parents' house where now they sit on those bookshelves. And some things I gave away to friends. And then I brought a only reduced library to where I live now. So part of the reason that my 21st century lit collection is smaller is because I got rid of a lot of books, but part is also that I hadn't been reading contemporary fiction for a really long time because one of the things that grad school does to you is it strips you of the joy of reading. I'm being a little bit dramatic, but also a little bit very honest. I stopped reading for fun for a few years actually in grad school because reading was work and I was reading all day, every day. And when I had time at the end of the day, I didn't want to use my brain for reading anymore. It was like I had a limited amount of reading capacity and I was using it all up for work. And so there was none left over for me, for fun. But in the past year and a half or so, I've been making a real conscious effort to read more and specifically to read a more varied selection of books and kind of go out from my comfort zone. And so we have some things in this stack that aren't the kinds of books that I would normally read. This book, for example, Salt and Broom, somebody actually on YouTube recommended this to me, and it's a retelling of Jane Eyre with witches. Delightful. This book I picked up in the store exclusively because of the cover, because look at that, it's a gorgeous cover, and I was not disappointed by the book. It's narrated by a ghost who is haunting the home lived in by Georges Sand and Chopin. This book I read recently after a friend recommended it to me, Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers. It's like a cozy murder mystery with found family themes when one of the main characters is a 60-year-old Chinese woman who owns a struggling tea shop, and there's all these descriptions of the tea she brews and her cozy homemade Chinese food that she gives to people, and it was really pleasant. This book, much less pleasant, much less cozy, tender as the flesh. I talk about cannibalism on the internet a lot, and so people recommend me books about cannibalism a lot. Sometimes I like the books, sometimes they really creep me out because even though I read and write and talk about cannibalism a fair amount, I'm a wimp. I have a weak stomach and a low tolerance for gore and creepy stuff. This book was very creepy and it was not for me. I read the whole thing. I'm not unhappy that I read it. I am going to keep it in my collection, but I'm never going to read it again. Sometimes people on the internet now will just say to me, like, I read this book about cannibalism and I thought of you. This movie has cannibalism in it. I think you would love it. And I never thought I was going to be the cannibalism girl. I hate Titus Andronicus. Anyway, As I said, when I was in grad school, for a long time, I all but entirely stopped reading for pleasure, with the only exception to that being romance novels. Romance novels were the balm for my overworked academic soul. Romance novels were literally the only thing I read for fun for years. Sometimes I will read 2 or 3 romance novels in one single day. If I have like a free Saturday, I'm on the couch, I'm settling in, I'm ripping through at least 2 novels before the day is done. I don't care if it's contemporary, it's historical, it's straight, it's queer, it's closed door, it's eye-meltingly explicit, first person, third person, enemies to lovers, friends to lovers. I don't give a fuck. It's a romance novel, I will read it. Given my genuinely insatiable appetite for romance novels, this is a relatively restrained stack that I have here. And that's because I own very few physical romance novels, because I sometimes will read through 3 of them in a day. I can't be buying books like that. There's no room in this house. And frankly, there's not room that I can justify in my budget. So I buy ebooks. So my Apple Books app, my Kindle app, those are overflowing with romance novels. My shelves, not so overflowing, just a healthy representation of romance novels. There's not much to mention here. I own every Emily Henry novel, and I will buy every single novel that she puts out, obviously. I love a classic romance novel cover. I love a shitty trade paperback falling apart, cracked spine, man shirt open, girl blue dress. It's always a blue dress falling off one shoulder, hair tossed in the wind. I see that, I love it. I'm hooked, I'm in. It's cheesy, it's terrible. I eat it up. What's that? Can it be? Oh yes, it's another girl in a blue dress falling off one shoulder, clinging to a man whose shirt is billowing open. This book is one of, I think, 3 reality TV romance novels I have read. The other 2 were cooking show romance novels, which were fantastic. This one is basically set in The Bachelor. It's a fictional version of The Bachelor, but it's The Bachelor. And the main character is a plus-size fashion blogger who writes this searing critique of the lack of body diversity on The Bachelor, and as a result is cast as the next lead. I want to say I wish that I had loved this. I only liked it, but it was pleasant. It was an easy read. I love reality TV show stuff. The lack of body diversity on reality TV, like real reality TV, is also a worthwhile point of discussion. So if you are also a romance novel fan and a reality TV fan, check it out. My nonfiction pile is a bit more extensive than I thought it would be, even though it's pretty small. There are a couple of these nonfiction books that are quite special to me. This one, I've owned this copy of Bird by Bird since I was in high school, at least, if not middle school. This is, of course, a book of writing advice. It contains the chapter Shitty First Drafts, which if you haven't read it, look it up. I believe you can find a PDF of it online. It's very short, and it is a brief chapter extolling the virtues of messing around in your first draft. It will make you feel better for reading it. Another piece of nonfiction writing I have that I feel quite fond of is the annotated prison writings of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was, of course, imprisoned for 2 years under official charges of gross indecency, which is to say sexual relationships with other men, and the trials were very public. They involved reading out loud excerpts from The Picture of Dorian Gray. I mentioned earlier that the version that was later published and now is more commonly published is an edited version that is meant to be less explicitly homoerotic, but even that toned down version was used as evidence against him during this trial. His legal troubles were a result of this kind of protracted legal aggression between himself and the father of his longtime lover. And some of these prison writings are directed towards that longtime lover of his who he felt extremely betrayed by. Do you really think that you were worthy of the love I was showing you then, or that for a single moment I thought you were? Do you really think that at any period in our friendship you were worthy of the love I showed you, or that for a single moment I thought you were? I knew you were not, but love does not traffic in a marketplace, nor use a huckster's scale. Its joys, like the joys of intellect, is to feel itself alive. You were my enemy, such an enemy as no man ever had. I had given you my life, and to gratify the lowest and most contemptible of all human passions, hatred and vanity and greed, you had thrown it away. This book is, to say the least, kind of a big bummer, but if you are a fan of Oscar Wilde's work or just find him an interesting figure in history, I do recommend reading this. Here we have my stack of books about food. Down here at the bottom, we have the collected works of MFK Fisher. She is your favorite food writer's favorite food writer. The Physiology of Taste, which contains the line, "Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are," commonly now rephrased as "You are what you eat." Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential. This one is a controversial entry into the food writing category, A Certain Hunger, which is a cannibalism book, but this one I quite enjoyed, and I decided that it should go with the food books rather than the contemporary fiction books because the main character of this book is a food writer who happens to enjoy occasionally eating her lovers. And I'm just saying, the liver and mushroom pate sounded very tasty. Granted, it was human liver, but still. This little book right here might be my favorite out of the whole stack of food writing books. Heartburn by Nora Ephron. If you have not read it, I can't recommend it highly enough. Nora Ephron, of course, is the writer behind all your favorite classic rom-coms, When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle, etc. And this book is just as enjoyable and fun as you would expect from the writer of those movies. There's also, of course, my collection of academic books. They are just kind of fun to look back on and remember the papers that I bought each one of them for, or the times spent with those books in particular chapters of my dissertation. Come to think of it, I don't want to look at that stack of books. So there you have it, my personal library, newly organized and inventoried. It is now time to start actually putting these back on the shelves, but I've got to be honest, I'm really enjoying having this little fortress of all my stacks of books. It's extremely cozy and kind of satisfying to be sat in the middle of all of these. But I will return my office to order. I will put these all back on their shelves, newly sorted and nice and neat, until eventually I've bought so many more books that I have to take them all down and reorganize them all over again.